mode.
Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar called Ramping Up from 0 to 60 miles per hour to Drive and Measure Social Engagement. I'm Debbie House, Editor-in-Chief of Retail TouchPoints, and I'll be moderating today's presentation. We have some great speakers and content for you today that will provide insights into business success with social tools and channels. So for today's presentation, we're using GoToWebinar. Right now, you should be viewing the GoToMeeting slide, which shows part of the control panel, including the area that will show you how to submit questions during the live presentation. All the instructions you need to view the presentation and submit questions is accessible on this control panel. We also welcome you to follow this webinar on Twitter using the Social Engage hashtag, as shown on the screen here. So for those of you who might be new to Retail Touchpoints, here's a quick overview. We're an all-digital media company publishing a weekly email online newsletter, daily news, special reports, and multimedia presentations. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to our weekly newsletter. And we welcome input and feedback through traditional means, phone and email, and also social media, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Our website is www.retailtouchpoints.com. So before I introduce today's speakers, I just want to remind our audience that the presentation is slated for approximately 45 minutes with time for live questions at the end. Please submit your questions in the GoToWebinar dashboard as they come to mind. Our speakers have agreed to stay online at the end of the presentation to respond to your questions. I also want to point out a few other housekeeping items for the attendees. This webinar is being recorded, and all attendees will receive an archived link to the presentation to go back and review or share with colleagues. In addition, the slides will be posted to SlideShare. That link, the link to access the on-demand presentation and the slides will be provided at the end of the presentation. So our first speaker today will be Dan Rubin, SVP Strategy and Insight Group at HARTE-HANKS. Dan has been with HARTE-HANKS since 1993 and was one of the founding members of the Analytics Group in 1995. In his various roles during the growth of this division, Dan has worked across all clients and industries ranging from retail, banking, gaming, automotive, high-tech, B2B, travel entertainment, pharmaceuticals to packaged goods. In his current role, Dan is responsible for developing and implementing analytics-based solutions to support HARTE-HANKS clients' CRM and their marketing objectives. These programs include marketing support, modeling and segmentation, reporting, web analysis, and general data mining methodologies. Before joining HARTE-HANKS, Dan worked at Epsilon, focusing on database marketing, database management, fulfillment systems, and reporting within the pharmaceutical industry. And prior to Epsilon, he worked for 4 years as a systems engineer at GTE. Then later in the presentation, Dan will be joined by Ken Blake, SVP Analytic Consulting Group at HARTE-HANKS. Ken leads HARTE-HANKS Analytic Consulting Group and brings more than 15 years of direct and digital marketing experience to clients. His primary focus is on developing and utilizing advanced analytic techniques to forge stronger, more profitable customer brand relationships. His areas of expertise include data modeling, segmentation, contact strategy, campaign analysis, engagement to purchase analysis, and primary research. Ken has worked on both the client and agency sides, and his work has supported Fortune 500 corporations across multiple industries, including pharmaceuticals, consumer packaged goods, retail, and automotive. His previous experience includes managing acquisition analytics with Bertelsmann, AG's direct group, and strategic analysis at TargetBase, a digital and direct marketing agency. So with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Dan. Welcome to you, Dan.
Okay, we just wanted to thank everybody for joining us today. And what we're going to do is we're going to walk you through our quick agenda of what we're going to cover. And we're going to start with what the market problem is and just describe to you what clients face and what people are facing today from the need to drive and measure social engagement and bringing that into the rest of the view of what their data looks like. We're going to then go into bridging the gap and understanding how we look at the differences between structured and unstructured data and how those are applied to better marketing. We're then going to go into social breadth and influence scoring, looking at a way to quantify and even segment how consumers are engaging through social channels. We're then going to take it beyond social linkage and look at how that segmentation can then be used for better marketing and more relevance. And then we're going to walk you through a case study, which will be a global cosmetic brand, so we can describe to you how somebody has done this today in a much more meaningful way, so you can actually see what's been done, how the consumers were viewed, and then how the contact strategies were developed so that we could actually act on this information and not just have this information. As we go to the next slide, we're going to start with the marketer's dilemma. And what's happening here, and this is something so many people are facing, is you've got more and more people every day engaging in social channels. Regardless of the social tool, there's so many options at their disposal. In addition, they're doing this on their smartphone. They're doing this on their tablet. They're buying, they're engaging, they're interacting, they're responding using every imaginable tool in every imaginable situation. It's not just limited to being at your desktop. It can happen anywhere. And the questions that keep arising are, where are your customers online? How do they engage? And what are they talking about when they engage? And when are they using these social tools? So ultimately, what we're trying to do is come up with a capability that will allow us to link this information with their purchase information, with their promotion history, so that we can figure out how to be most impactful, and at the same time, how to invest properly in these groups. You know, and having said that, this really comes down to trying to determine, where are these customers online? Are they on Facebook? Are they on Twitter? Are they somewhere else? Are they still hovering on MySpace somewhere? Can we tell what's exactly happening when they are there? When are they engaging with us? At what point in the customer life cycle? I'm not talking about when as in the time of day. I'm talking about when they're in that purchase cycle. Are they using this for research, referrals, advocacy? Are they using this for purchase? What part of that life cycle are they using social tools for, and which social tools are coming in to play at that point in time? And then finally, it's, you know, being able to figure out who these targets are, but do we know how to message them? How to provide the right content, the right topic? What are the key words that are going to align best with these groups? And ultimately, and this is the way we often put it, it's meeting the customer where they are and not having the customer come to us based upon what we have to offer. So making sure that we understand what's going to make a difference to them, and then coming up with a way to be relevant and meaningful in that channel at that time with the right content, with the right relevance. As we go to the next slide, let's pick this apart a little more. And first off, we're going to be looking at, where are our customers online? And really, in order to answer this, we're going to have to look deeper into customers' online behavior and preferences. Are they using social? Which social media sites are they using? Is there a pattern? How do I take this information? And if you look at this pseudo Venn diagram, how do I take this information and look at it across certain groups? So it's one thing to look at this holistically across my entire customer base, but what happens when I start to drill down deeper and look by segment? What if I look by purchase category, or by recent customers or new customers, or if I start to look by demographic profile? What can I learn from this type of Venn diagram when I start to look at it by meaningful segments? Because that's ultimately how I'm going to communicate to them. And then it's about taking that information, bringing it into my database so that I can ultimately form not maybe a full 360-degree view, but pretty close, closer than I've ever been before. And then being able to create super segments, segments that go beyond just what they purchased, but now I've got a social component to it too, which we're going to walk you through momentarily in a few slides. If you go to the next slide, Ken. So once we go to the incomplete customer view, we talk about what we know about these consumers. And what this really represents, for those of you old enough to remember the old game show Concentration, as each piece of these data are revealed, we see more and more about our customer. And in a way, this is a mosaic that helps depict that. So if we start with promotion history, almost every database has a level of promotion history available today. We know the number of contacts. We know who was communicated to. We know how they were communicated to. Nowadays, we know the channel. We know a little bit about what they engage, how they engage, and whether or not they're fully engaged in those channels. And as we start to move from piece to piece here, we're going to be able to take that information and build on who this consumer is. As we then go to the segments, we're able to develop more detailed segments. We're able to look at customer value and RFM. I mean, RFMs, here we are talking about social channels and how they've grown in the past few years, and now we're referring to RFM, which has been around for 20 to 30 years. Then as we migrate from these segments, we start to go into purchase history. And as much as purchase history is king and drives so much behavior on a day-to-day basis, we're now starting to see an incredible balance between purchase and engagement. But purchase is still a key foundation to any database. But as I said, that leads us into engagement. Call center, opt-ins, email response, preference center engagement, social channels, you name it. We're now starting to see more and more engagement show up in all of our predictive models, in all of our segmentation. And in the old days where it might be purchase behavior with a little bit of demographics and a little bit of response history, now we're seeing engagement weigh in almost as much as purchase behavior. And then finally, you're left with this core group of, well, you still have web data, but you're left with this additional data that's now starting to get us to that next level. How do I engage with them in using social media? And that gives us these social profiles, the influencing power, and how do I bring these components into my database? How do I quantify this activity? How do I get this activity first? Then how do I quantify it? Then how do I use it? And as each of these pieces of the tiles get chipped away, I get a better view of what's behind it. I also get a better view of how I want to market to them, the channels I want to use, and now I can start to measure to determine how effective I am with these strategies and how I need to refine them going forward. Next slide. Which ultimately leads us to, when are they using these tools? Where the previous slide tells me who they are and what they're doing in many different ways, this slide starts to get into where are they tapping into these channels. And what's absolutely incredible about a slide like this, and you've probably seen versions of this slide before, is those little colored circles ultimately are the ways a consumer can engage with the brand. And as you move from left to right, you've got everything from consideration to evaluation to purchase to advocacy. So this is really just a very convoluted funnel, but it's the convoluted funnel that represents the marketing today. And what's amazing when you see this is at any point in this cycle, there's no less than 3 channels for a consumer to engage with the brand. And in some cases, many cases, there's as many as 7 channels. So this really speaks to the part of understanding where are they engaging with me, to what degree are they engaging, and how can I meet them where they want to engage. And by doing this, this helps me not only understand how I'm going to start marketing to my existing consumers, who I know so much about, but it will also help me figure out what do I do with the new consumer, or the new consumer who's only recently engaged with me, and how do I tie social media into my contact strategy so that it works with all the other ways I've been communicating to my customers all along, and then how do I balance that to get the best possible results. As we go to the next slide, we're going to then address in this presentation, how do they engage? And it really comes down to understanding, using social media to encourage consumer participation. And one of the things we mentioned on the mosaic slide, or the tiled slide a few slides ago, is engagement is almost becoming the new purchase. In the old days, I would know that you bought or you didn't buy, and I might know some promotion history along the way. But now I've got all this engagement data that can bridge and stretch me from a non-purchase to a purchase, and I have all these shades of gray that I've never had before. And it really comes to how do I now engage or provide the opportunities to create more of that data. I'm going to gather it anyways, but if I give my consumers the opportunity to engage, I can create more of that data, which will give me a better opportunity to use it. And now what that allows me to do is looking, at the overall picture, which will give me much more information than I ever had before. In addition, I can start to, as I mentioned, break this out and determine how it varies by segment. How do my best customers do compared to my average? How does my average do compared to my low end or my rest? How does this differ across modeling deciles? And now as I've got that, I can start to create these customized marketing strategies for each major segment or minor segment based on not just all the data I used to know, but now based on their preferences, their likes, their interests. I can look at nurturing and cultivating brand advocates as needed or as wanted. I can also look across certain categories to see if I might have an advocacy issue in certain areas and maybe a huge advocacy opportunity in others. But what this allows me to do is it gives me more information than I've ever had, which is a great thing, but from a standpoint of creating those contact strategies and measurement can also be a little bit of a scary thing. So what Ken's going to do now is going to explain to you how we bridge this gap, how we pull this data together so that we have it and we can start to use it.
Thanks, Dan. So I think it's a good overview of what the problems are out in the market. So now let's start talking about the solutions. One reality that all marketers need to face in today's world is that ignoring social isn't really a viable option anymore. And part of that is because your competition is out there and increasingly leveraging social in a bigger way than they were in the past, and we expect that trajectory to increase in the future. And it's partly because the insight that's available out there through social channels is so immense that it would just be foolish to not utilize this data in some way. So it's really not a question of if you should use social. It's more a decision around how and to what extent you're going to leverage it. For example, some of you might use social to predict future trends and to inform product development efforts based on the conversations that you're seeing out there at an aggregate level. Some of you may use it to enhance your existing customer segmentation schemes. And some of you may actually inject yourselves directly into conversations as they're occurring and use that as a way to create stronger connections with customers and your prospects. And those are just a few ways social media and the data can be used to enable better marketing. Having said that, one of the big challenges out there is putting an identity on the various people engaging in social channels has been a challenge and continues to be a challenge for a lot of marketers. So while we may be out there listening to conversations and extracting market level insight from those conversations, and while there's certainly value in that, but in order to make that truly actionable and to take that insight to the next level and leverage it for one-to-one marketing strategies, we really want to understand who these people are. And that's where social linkage comes into play. So our social linkage solution, we're able to take an email address or even a set of email addresses and turn them into social identities and profiles to get a fuller picture of who that customer is and what their behavior means. And on top of that, if it happens to be a customer that we've seen before, either they've purchased with us before, they've engaged through some other online or offline channel, so we have some history on them, then we can truly integrate their social activity with their other online and offline activity to create that 360-degree view of the customer that we're all looking for. And then from there, that enablement will allow us to design and target customized and relevant communications to either broad customer segments or even at the individual level, which you can then deliver either within social channels, through other channels, or through a combination of both of those. So if you look at that dotted box under John Doe, you see some of the types of data that can come across just from that initial social linkage and profiling process, which might include their various social IDs for the various social sites. It may include some demographics. It may include some insight into how influential they are out in the social space. And as I mentioned before, then we can bring that all together with everything else we know about them, such as purchase history, engagement, and richer demographics that we may already be carrying. So out of this combination, we're able to distinguish between our brand advocates or our potential advocates and distinguish them from everyone else out in the social space so that when we're marketing to them, we're doing so in a way that makes sense based on their potential value to the brand. So once we've created those profiles through social linkage and enriched them with other data, we can then apply what we call our social linkage and influence measurement, or SAM framework, to turn this insight into actionable strategies. At the foundation of this framework is the calculation of two scores, and they're very basic in terms of thinking about them, but there's some complexity about how they're calculated, and we'll talk about that in a bit. The first is what we call the social breadth score, which think of as essentially a measure of a person's overall involvement with social media. For example, it may be the number of sites that they're engaged with. And then secondly, there's a social influencer score, which is essentially a measure of how impactful they tend to be across those social sites. So this influencer score is calculated through a variety of attributes, such as how much reaction do they get when they post some type of social content or any type of message. So in other words, when they're out there talking in the social space, is anyone listening to them? So digging a little deeper into that social breadth score, it's important to note that because we've already made that linkage between a customer's or a prospect's social activity and their activity elsewhere, we're able to understand their involvement in social, not just in a vacuum, but also relative to other channels. So for example, if we had two individuals who were both moderately involved with Twitter and Facebook, without social linkage, we'd probably view them as being very similar customers, and we'd probably market to them in very similar ways. But if we knew that person number one was also heavily engaged with email, direct mail, and other digital channels, while person number two had shown very little engagement with those non-social channels, we would know that in order to reach person number two, social might be our only viable option. Where for that first person, it's probably some type of hybrid marketing strategy that includes both social and non-social messaging. Now, further, the observed social activity can give us a sense of why each customer uses it as it relates to the brand. And one of the things when you saw the customer journey that Dan talked through is that customers' needs at various points of interaction tend to vary a lot, and the same thing is true within social. For example, do they use it just for product research, or are they using it to transact? Are they using it to advocate on behalf of your brand, or even for a competitive brand, or is it some combination of all of those? So you'll see that the way that we lay this out in terms of social breadth is that we use that score to segment customers into rookies, knights, warriors, and titans, and depending on where they fall across the spectrum, we can design and message and channel strategies that are best suited to their individual needs and preferences. Now as we turn to the influencer score, we can think of this across three different levels. A buyer is at the lowest level, so this is someone who primarily engages on social channels just to stay in touch with brands that they buy, but they may not do a lot more. The explorer has a deeper social relationship with the brands that they buy and are more likely to use social tools as either the actual means to making a purchase or at least as a component of their research and purchase process. And then influencer is the highest level. These customers are actively speaking about your brand within social channels, and as we mentioned earlier, these are also the customers who have an audience which listens to what they say. So you can imagine that the strategies you want to use from a social marketing standpoint need to be very different for these three types of groups. For buyers, you may just need to engage them through your Facebook and Twitter pages. For explorers, they'll probably be looking for tools to browse ratings. They may want to look at customer reviews, other community-driven feedback, so you want to provide them the tools where they can access that type of information. And for influencers, the goal there is to maximize the value they have out in the space where there's an enormous opportunity to actively engage with them, nurture that relationship through a variety of social channels, and leverage them to expand your reach when you have an important message to share. And because they have that high influencer score, chances are certain messages would be more impactful if they deliver them versus your brand delivering them. So as we tie this all together, think of social breadth as essentially answering the where and the when. Which social channels are your customers engaging with, and when do they use these channels during their buying process? So from that insight, we can determine the right social versus non-social channel mix from a volume standpoint, but also from a needs-based standpoint, since we're able to determine not only which channels they engage with the most, but also which decisions they're making within each of those channels. So just a couple quick examples of that. For a night, it's likely that social media won't be the central hook that you'll use. But since they have shown at least some appreciation for branded social interactions, we may invite them to join social pages and provide them with an incentive to get more engaged. But for a Titan, where the opportunity is much bigger and where their primary engagement channel of choice is social, you'll want to leverage their heavy interaction in very different ways than you would a night. So instead of simply inviting them to join social pages and offering incentives for getting more engaged, you'll want to invite them to rate and review your products and provide them incentives for speaking about your brand. Now moving on to the social influencer score, this is less about the where and the when and more about the how and the what. How are they engaging with social, and when they're out there, what are they talking about? What topics are they talking about? So like we discussed with the social breadth score, the appropriate marketing strategies for these segments are going to vary depending on whether they're a buyer, explorer, or influencer. So engaging a buyer through your Facebook page may be good enough until they show some level of activity that goes beyond that. But for an influencer, you have the opportunity to exponentially increase the value of that customer because we know they are talking and we know that people are listening to them. So our goal with them is to nurture that relationship and provide them with the tools to ensure that you benefit from the powerful voice that they have. So now let's talk about the S.A.M framework in some more detail and see how this all works in action. And at a high level, you'll see that social breadth scores are plotted on the y-axis and the social influencer scores plotted on the x-axis. So what this allows us to do is quadrant all of your customers or prospects based on their presence, the level of activity, and the level of influence. So this framework is just the starting point before we deploy any specific strategies. Now, depending on where each customer falls across the quadrants, we can begin to execute on those various strategies we discussed earlier. And prior to launching these, there's another step that you can go through to do some further profiling to better understand the specific likes and specific topics of interest for each customer. Because ultimately what you want to get to is a strategy that right-sizes your channel investment. It optimizes our needs-based message mix for each channel, for each person, so that a customer who's using social just for research is treated very differently than a customer who's using social for advocacy. And then we can become even more surgically relevant by incorporating some of those individual topic interest attributes that we've captured either via their social activity or based on some of the other data that we talked about before. We may know what their interests are based on survey data. We may know based on what their purchase history is. We may know based on their engagement history. So from there, we can use this framework to measure our effectiveness against each quadrant, both in terms of how much value we drive from the quadrant, but also to track any migration of customers into more socially engaged quadrants. So from there, I'm going to turn it back to Dan. He'll take you through a real-world case study.
So from a case study standpoint, what we want to do is we want to take this one step deeper and make this a little more real. And as we go over to the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about the brand Snapshot. So what we're looking at here was a leading cosmetic brand that is extremely socially driven. They have been relying on social marketing for years. They were very early to the table, and they continue to use it to drive awareness, to drive advocacy, and really just to help create the conversations out in the marketplace to help cross-sell and to help people be aware as new products are launched. So it's an incredibly sophisticated strategy, but interestingly, for those first several years of having this in place, they didn't really have a way of measuring the impact. And now they do. So with the recent launch of a product, what they want to do, they want to sell through the internet, their franchise store, and their distribution channels, which are typically the way they sell any product. So they have a website, they have their own stores, and then they have all the department stores and all the outlets that any cosmetic brand would have. But with this launch, they wanted to be able to leverage their existing fan base to drive traffic and initial sales. So they wanted to make sure that the folks who are already out there and engaged were going to be buying, and they wanted to drive sales that way. Then they wanted to engage new prospects so they could create social traffic among the new audience. So basically, it was an acquisition plan using social. And then finally, it was the whole idea to promote brand advocacy, or in their case, continue to promote brand advocacy, especially around the launch, so that they would then go out and not only identify the influencers, but recruit new ones, or recruit people that they felt had a likelihood to be an influencer. And as you can see at the bottom of the slide, they set up some objectives, some very aggressive objectives, especially considering that this was a socially driven launch. And what we want to do is walk you through what we did to get there. Next slide. So immediately, social linkage allowed us to identify and target the key influencers and prioritize them for our marketing efforts, which goes back to the 2x2 grid that Ken was starting to walk people through a few slides ago. And from here, what we could do is we could start to focus on the groups that matter. We could start to look at segments and demographics within this group that were common among our key targets, but begin to tailor them so that we could build around their specific needs. So in the old days, we might be able to identify a male-female split, which could drive our communications and help us be more relevant. Now, if we can add in their interests, if we can add in their engagement, and their social breadth, plus their likelihood to influence, we can take that one step further. And all of a sudden, you can see that 56% female group can get broken into several subgroups very quickly and very easily, where each one has a different way we might talk to them. This also allows us to really develop dynamic content around the specifics of what that group is and what they look like. And then it allows me to encourage brand advocacy where it matters. To somebody who's new to social channel and new to the brand, brand advocacy might not be my top priority. But to somebody who's been established, has been around, has been out there talking on our behalf, that very well should be a top priority. And quick side note, one of the ways you can tell from this slide that this is a very masked presentation is in the world of cosmetics, a male-female pie chart would never look like that. It would be extremely female rather, and very little male. So just a quick side note, while the example we're providing is very real, obviously the numbers have been changed to protect the innocent. As we go to the next slide, we've got our focus on key sites. And the question here is, where are they interacting? Where are they engaging? What's the best place to meet them on or meet them at? This approach allows us to determine whether our influencers are more active on Facebook, Twitter. Is it a combination? Is it something else? You know, as you can see, as you might expect, and as you can see, Facebook and Twitter pretty much drive this kind of graph. This is where people are. These are the sites that make sense. But there are a smattering of other sites there. We have Google+, we still have MySpace and Flickr out there, and LinkedIn. And while this product might not scream for a LinkedIn strategy, there are situations we've had in the past 2 years where LinkedIn strategy has been key because it works beautifully with Facebook for a certain audience, for a certain product. But what this does allow us to do is avoid wasting budget. It just like a predictive model does, this type of information helps us understand where we want to invest, but just as importantly, where we don't want to be investing or investing minimally. It complements our CRM efforts by making sure that we are directing people to the right places. And from a community management standpoint, it helps us focus those efforts on the key sites, the ones that are going to get us the best possible results based upon our understanding of who they are and where they are. Now, if we take it to the SAM framework on the next slide, we can start to look at our social breadth and our social influencer scores. And when we first calculate this out, we can start to understand who is socially active from the brand's customer base. Are they online? And then we can start to look and understand on the left-hand side that I've got a large portion of my population that doesn't have a lot of social breadth. 10%, those are scores across the bottom, but a very small percentage is actually heavily engaged. And as you can see, as we drop from a score of 1 to 2, their breadth of engagement drops off significantly. I mean, not significantly, drastically. And then as we go to the social influencer score, as you start to pick apart those pie segments, at first glance you look and you say, my God, 63% of them really are minimally have no chance of being an influencer. Today, it's so low they're barely registering a pulse. But if I actually look at the next two segments, the 21% and 6%, it actually comes out to be about 90% have a very low influencer score. So once again, it helps me identify how big an audience do I actually have and who are they. And if I go to the next slide, I can start to create the initial round of segments. I can start to break them into groups. And just on the breadth score, we've named them something semi-relevant, and we've got rookies. This is 90% of my customer base who's got a score of 1 to 3. Not a lot of breadth going on there. Then I start to move up the spectrum, and my next group's 4%. My warriors are 1.5, and the top of the heap are my titans at less than 1%. But the interesting thing is, as I'm starting to look for those advocates, as I'm starting to look for those people who can help me from a social standpoint, I don't need a lot. But what I need to do is understand who they are and what I can do with them. And then I need to understand those lower groups to figure out if there's anybody out there that has the potential. And then similarly, from an influencer score, we've got the same thing going on. We've got a set of scores from the previous pie chart that helps us understand where our opportunity is. And it's 80% really in the lower ranks. Who are my buyers? They're out there. They're buying my product. They're not going to be an influencer, but that's okay. And then it's that upper group, that 8% where I really have somebody who's out there speaking to what I need to have done. And now if I take that one step further, I can start to plot that on my framework. And if we go to the next slide, there we go. We now start to break this into 4 groups. And we've been doing 2x2 quadrants forever, whether it's purchase and response, whether it's value and potential value, whether it's loyalty and lifetime spend. All of these things can be plotted here because it gives us the framework to start figuring out how I'm going to talk to them, what I'm going to say, what my potential, what my goals are, and also what investment's going to be necessary to create the results I want. So when I do plot these onto the framework here, what I start to see is a major chunk of the customers fall under, low social breadth and low influencer score. And this is not uncommon. The size of these circles really do end up being a bit of a shock. You never have as many people in the top right as you wish you had, and you always have way more in the bottom left than you thought you had. But what this does allow me to do is it allows me to start to figure out that in all of these quadrants, I've got a different approach. I've got to set different goals. I want to achieve different things, and I need to do that using different channels. So what the message here is, social doesn't replace the other channels, but when we use it and deploy it with a well-thought-out strategy, it can certainly complement those other channels. And if we go to the next slide, we take that one step further. And you can kind of see in the top right, we start to talk about investing in providing limited free products in turn for feedback, reviews, and ratings. Encourage them to promote the brand. Give them a reason to promote. They might already have that reason, and maybe some of them don't even need the free product, but if we can cement that relationship as an advocate, all the better. As we start to go to the second group, which is in the upper left quadrant, we start to see, these people have a high breadth, lower influencer score, so we want them to interact. We want to have a social campaign hit them. We want to promote our social channels. We're looking for sales. We're looking to increase fan following on social pages, and we want the brands, we want to allow them to engage. That's what these people want to do. They're engagers. They might not ever be advocates, but so my metrics here are more about engagement, less about advocacy. As I go to the bottom right, these are my low social breadth, but high potential influencer, typically not a big group. Sometimes it is, depending upon the brand. And here I want to maximize that social advocacy. I want to identify the major sites, incent them to be socially active, tweet some social activity to get a point or a coupon entry to sweepstakes. Get them to take that one next step. And then in that bottom left, this will warm the hearts of all CRM people out there. These are folks who really aren't influencers, and they barely have any social breadth. This is your old school email, direct mail crowd. And yes, I said direct mail. First time I think it got said in a presentation about social media and social measurement. But this is a group that will respond to this. They're not out there on the social networks. They're not somebody that's going to resonate with. So I want to meet them where they interact. And I've got the data to do this. So let's hit them up with some email. If they're high value groups within this circle, and I'm sure there are, I can invest direct mail to even move that needle. But now you can start to see that my metrics here are so different than the metrics in the top left and the top right. And it's important to make sure that we're setting those goals, because if we use the same metrics in the top right as we do in the bottom left, that bottom left group is never going to succeed. So it's important to make sure that their contact strategy is different, but their measurement approach is also different. Then if we go to the next slide, we now have a little bit more detail around it. So if we start to look, we can start to see what we achieved when we went to market. How many, if we look in the top right, we take those KPIs or those metrics one step further. In the top right, I'm measuring impressions. In the bottom left, I'm measuring clicks. And that gives me the ability to now figure out what really is working and what I need to change going forward. Now, if I continue on that trend, I can now make sure that not only are my goals set from the get-go, but every quarter, every 6 months, I want to consider resetting those goals, because they're going to change over time. as people get more used to the messaging, as they get more used to the channels, I might start to see them decline. I might start to see them increase in certain areas. But I want to keep track of what's working and what isn't. And then finally, I've got to keep track of whether these KPIs really are KPIs. What I think are going to be KPIs in year 1 might not be KPIs in year 2. They might be metrics, but they're not driving my business anymore for whatever reason. And that might be a simple thing such as click-through down in the bottom left. As I start to migrate those customers into another quadrant, or as they migrate themselves into another quadrant, they need to shift and meet the KPIs that are present in that quadrant, because the click-through no longer will be relevant for them. And as we go to the next slide, well, we're going to shift back to Ken to talk about how we take this one step beyond. But the key really is that, like it's been for the past 10, 20 years, there are major differences within our groups, and the key is really having something like that S.A.M framework that allows us to differentiate them, and differentiate them at a level that is extremely actionable, extremely measurable, but allows us to talk to them and meet them where they are. Over to you, Ken.
So we hope that the message we've delivered is not just seen as a standalone approach to using social media more effectively, because for a social strategy to be truly effective, it really can't exist in a vacuum. As we mentioned earlier, that social breadth score needs to be viewed in the context of all their engagement. So we need to look at how it compares to their non-social engagement, so that when we do balance their social and non-social marketing strategies against them, it's fully aligned with what that customer's relative need is and what their relative involvement is across each channel. So this is really as much of a marketing integration and optimization story as it is a social strategy story. Because in fact, number 1 you see up there, that customer journey is no longer linear, and Dan went through that earlier. Customers have different needs at different points of time, and they expect to have those needs fulfilled wherever they are. So when we talk about creating that complete profile and enabling that identification of customers across all channels, that's critical to our ability to meet those needs, because if we don't know where they are and we don't know what they need at that location at that time, we're not going to be in a position to fulfill their needs very well. So we mentioned earlier that ignoring social is no longer an option. It is more a decision around how are you going to use it and to what extent are you going to leverage it. And that those who integrate their various channel marketing strategies most effectively, rather than keeping them in silos, will be the ones who are most effective. So looking a little bit further down the road, once you have something like social linkage in place, it can enable either the introduction of additional tools or just the better leveraging of tools that you may already have in place. So most of you probably have some type of predictive modeling in place. Maybe it's to identify customers most likely to respond to a promotion. Maybe it's to determine the right product to promote to a certain customer. Maybe it's to predict the lifetime value of that customer or that segment. So when you're able to incorporate some of this social data into the mix, those tools can remain in place, but they become much more powerful because now you're working with a much more complete picture of their data and of their profile. And then you can also overlay things like social listening tools and use natural language processing to get even more insight into the conversations that are being had about your brand or even about your competitors. So think of social linkage not only as a tool for designing and executing impactful social programs, but also as a way to enhance the value of existing tools, to enhance the kind of things you're doing today, while also enriching that customer knowledge, which you can then apply to all areas of your marketing strategy, not just social. So then finally, if you do want to embark on a social strategy and utilize something like social linkage to get there, the process is pretty straightforward. It starts with a discovery session where we'll work with you to map out what your objectives are, size all the various opportunities for your business, because those will be unique to your business, and that's important for how we prioritize. And from there, we'll develop a roadmap that's in line with those objectives, prioritize based on your organization's, but what the business case says, but also your organization's appetite for adoption. So for some of you, that may be just a crawl, walk, run approach, and for others, it might be a much more aggressive trajectory where we're incorporating things like predictive modeling and social listening or other tools up front. It really depends on the particulars of your business and the specific objectives and appetite you have. And then from there, we move on to execution and measurement mode. And with that, I'll thank you for joining, and we're happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Ken and Dan. You shared a lot of terrific information, and I think all of our attendees are taking home a lot of great information they can use in order to improve their businesses with social channels. So I just want to let everyone know, just to remind everyone who's attending, if you have any questions for Ken and Dan, you can submit them now. If we're not able to get to them during the live Q&A, they'll be able to follow up with you afterwards. So I do have a couple of questions for both of you. I'll throw out the question and then you can fight over who's going to answer it first. So the first one is a question from a sporting goods retailer, and this retailer says, we're making resource investment decisions on social media, and the #1 problem we're facing right now is the siloed data sets that we have. It limits us from creating a consolidated marketing strategy. So from what you showed us today, it looks like social linkage would be a great fit. Could you tell me how to handle that integration?
Yeah, good question, because that's a question that we get from a lot of our clients, because we go to them talking about how to bring social media into the mix, and the first answer is, I haven't even integrated my other stuff yet. So clearly that's one of the components that we'd want to focus on. It's figuring out what the value is of the various types of data that you have, and then prioritizing the integration based on that. Because you can get a lot of value from what you have access to today. That's typically what we find. And starting with an integration strategy before you determine what that overall marketing strategy is where a lot of things fall down. So what we recommend is creating business cases up front, identifying what those opportunities are, and then mapping that integration strategy with those opportunities. Social linkage certainly can become a key part of that, because you're not only bringing in that missing data set, or that missing insight into what customers are doing out there outside of your traditional CRM channels, but it's also enhancing some of the tools you have in place from a predictive modeling and segmentation standpoint.
All right, terrific. All right, so another question I think is a common issue that a lot of people have, and this question says, I personally have 4 email addresses between my work and 3 other active emails. How hard is it to tie all of these together to get one look at a customer?
Well, it is hard, and that's one of the reasons why we developed this solution. So the difficulty of bringing all that together is highly dependent on what else you know about that email address rather than just the email address itself. So do you know anything about their name or address? Do you have any demographics on them? One of the things that we do during social linkage is to append a variety of data elements to each individual email address so that we can make those judgment calls. So when we enrich the data and then match everything together, we have a much better sense of which of those email addresses belong to one customer. And you'll see some customers who have 6 or 7 email addresses associated with them. They may not be email addresses that they're necessarily actively using, but if they're using them as a login for Facebook, that's important for us to know, because they may not be reachable through that email address, but that's how we would link them to that customer. So that's extremely difficult to do, and that's one of the differentiating characteristics of social linkage.
All right, terrific. So I have a question about social linkage itself and the definition. Is social linkage the same as a social listening or social monitoring tool?
You know, they can be used together, but they're not the same. So think of social listening as more of an aggregate level view into what customers are saying, which is valuable on its own, but it tends to not be that actionable other than for very broad marketing strategies, very broad messaging strategies, maybe product development strategies. But what social linkage does is it allows you to understand who's saying those things, and then who is out there listening to them. So that not only allows you to use that data to segment your customers more effectively, but now you're able to go out directly to those customers with relevant messages informed by both their social and non-social behaviors, and we have a better sense of what that customer's overall area of knowledge is around some of the conversations happening out there, because we've linked it to that customer, so we know if they're saying something, but we also know if they're listening to something.
All right, great. Okay, another question. My company uses social media sites now, but we're unable to get these social media profiles into records. How have you seen other companies do this?
Let me grab that one.
Okay.
So yes, a lot of times brands end up spending a lot of money and resources on building a social presence, which is necessary. So you can't skip that step. But when the question is really how is too much, we're spending all our marketing dollars in creating accounts on social sites and managing the traffic, or are we able to effectively use some marketing strategies to close the sale? By bridging the gap and measuring ROI on social media, this is one of the biggest challenges we hear our clients complain about. And it's been going on, I mean, it's not just even social channels. I mean, we've been hearing that across many channels and just the interference of many channels over time. The solution to that is creating an effective roadmap that doesn't overburden your marketing resources. So but it allows you to smartly allocate your budget and drive sales through those social channels. And it's kind of what Ken said a couple questions ago. It's having a plan in place or deciding what you're trying to accomplish before you actually undertake some of these, because some of these, it requires a lot of work and investment. And unless you know what you want out of it at the end, you can spend even more time and more dollars than you need to, and oftentimes come up with something that doesn't work for you.
All right, great. Can you also talk a little bit about how social linkage can work with other sites other than Facebook, Twitter, and Google+?
Yeah, sure. The tracking and monitoring we do covers close to 200 sites. Mm-hmm. So the picture you get of your customers is very comprehensive. Now, obviously, most of you are going to find that sites like Facebook and Twitter are probably going to be the two most common across your customer base in aggregate. But we think it's really important to take this more comprehensive view, because you'll find certain segments that may be much more engaged than average with something like Pinterest or other smaller sites. And it's partly because the social usage, or the social usage landscape is so dynamic, and that, well, we all assume Facebook will be around in a couple of years. There are articles out there saying that Facebook usage is likely to drop off dramatically in a few years and be replaced by something that probably hasn't even been developed yet. So with that kind of dynamic change in the marketplace, having a pulse on what your customers are doing, even on sites that seem, or social media channels that seem kind of irrelevant today, they can become relevant really quickly. So with our approach, it keeps an eye on everything happening out there, so we're ready to shift with the market, because what we won't be successful at is predicting what the next big thing in social is, because it may be a company that hasn't been developed yet.
Absolutely. That's a good point. Finally, I just wanted to find out a little bit, can you talk a little bit about the timeline for implementing solutions like you're talking about today? Anyone?
Sure. Sorry, I was on mute.
Thanks. That's okay.
It varies based on what that discovery session looks like. So we can start tracking and monitoring data within a matter of a week or so. The longer term process is, okay, now that we brought this data in and we're starting to do some analysis, we're starting to do some segmentation, we can be a month to 6 weeks in and have a good feel for who these customers are. And then the question is, what kind of strategies are we developing off that? So, I'd say a 4 to 6 week process to have a general sense of what's possible and what the potential opportunity is. And then depending on what kind of strategies are going to be deployed, that can happen either in a phased approach, which is typically what we'll recommend, because we want to do some testing rather than just assuming everything that we've learned is going to hold true in the future, and that we've correctly designed every strategy in a perfect way, because no matter how informed a strategy is, it still needs to be tested, it still needs to be measured, it still needs to be optimized.
All right, great. So before we wrap up, I just want to ask Ken and Dan, do you have any final thoughts that you want to share with the audience today?
I think the one final thought I had as we put this deck together was the methodology and the approach to coming up with the key contact strategies and measurement plans has not changed over the years. It's still the same regardless of the channels. The key is it's having more information across all these data feeds, all these marketing channels that a lot of people don't have access to. So whether it's the social linkage, whether it's enhancing your engagement data, all of those pieces make up a key piece of the puzzle, and the more pieces you can put in place, the better those contact strategies will be, and the better your results will be.
All right. So I think we're just about out of time. You can see on the screen right now the link to the slides, but you'll also receive an email, and as I mentioned earlier, they'll be available via SlideShare. So once again, I want to thank Ken and Dan for the presentation. It was terrific. A lot of great information, a lot of great examples. And I want to thank all of our attendees for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day.
The organizer